Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to ACM. My name is Louise. I am the Assistant Curator of Chinese Art here at the museum and also the curator of the special exhibition currently on view at the Peranakan Museum, Fukusa Japanese Gift Covers from the Chris Hall Collection. I will be moderating today's session. ACM Conversations is a series of monthly talks that brings together leading scholars, cultural practitioners, artisans, and community resource persons in Singapore and from abroad in conversation with curators and educators at ACM. This talk series would not have been possible without the generous support of Royal Insignia, a premier luxury brand for medals, jewelry, and fine gifts for members of the world's royal families and international ministries. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Christine Guth speak about Fukusa as part of the wider culture of spectacle in pre-modern Japan. Fukusa, silk squares decorated with woven patterns, embroidery, or dyed in ink and colors, played a central role in ceremonial gift-giving in Japan between the 17th and the 19th centuries. Dr. Guth serves as curatorial advisor and contributing author for the Fukusa exhibition and catalog. She is a leading expert on Japanese art and design, and she led the Asian specialism in the postgraduate History of Design program at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Royal College of Art from 2007 to 2016. She has also written widely about Japanese art and cultural exchange between the US and Japan. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Guth on stage.
And move the speaker down a little bit slower. Can you all hear me? Good. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've had 2 wonderful days exploring this museum and, of course, also seeing the Fukusa exhibition, which was a special treat because until today, I'd only seen photographs. So it's been a real honor and pleasure for me to serve as consulting curator for this exhibition, the Chris Hall Collection. This show is really exceptional in quality and range, but also in its very subject matter. Because Fukusa ceremonial gift covers are a relatively understudied art form. They've only been the subject very, very rarely of dedicated exhibitions, even in Japan. So it's been a real thrill for me to finally see the original works of art and the wonderful installation that Louise supervised. It's also a pleasure for me to be able to speak about them to this audience. This is the first time I've spoken about them in public. I focus on writing about them before, so this is also a very special occasion for me. Is it okay? Do you need me to move this down some more? Okay. Is that better now? Okay, thanks. So when I was asked to provide a title for my presentation some months ago, I proposed Fukusa and the Culture of Spectacle, which you see here. I'd hoped to provide a fresh way of understanding these gift coverings, what they mean, and why they're important, by exploring how they function in a wider culture of performative display. But in the process of writing, as so often happens, my thinking moved away from the spectacle per se to a concern with layering, layers, as a key aspect of their spectacular form and function. Now, more than just piling things one on top of another, layer is an act that adds physical weight, volume, and visual and material interest. And in the case of textiles, through the addition of different weaves, textures, and decorative techniques, really complicates the way in which Fukusa are presented. Historically, in Japan, as in many parts of the world, layers of clothing and other materials speak not only to visual beauty, but also to wealth and to aristocratic sensibility. Now, layering has been a notable feature of Japanese design practice with both functional and ornamental dimensions. It's closely bound up with the protocols of gifting and the hierarchical structures of society as expressed in dress. Layering can also be metaphorical. Even as an embroidered design may add three-dimensionality and ornamental appeal to fabric, its motifs can also add a layer of meaning that transcends the material from which it's made. So what I'm going to talk about today is the culture, the materiality, and the metaphorics of layering. These are the three interrelated lenses through which I'm going to look at Fukusa. But I think before we turn to this topic, I should give you a little bit of an introduction to Fukusa. I'm sure most of you have seen the exhibition, but it's perhaps useful to ask the question, what is a Fukusa? Well, there we go. Fukusa is a roughly square piece of lined fabric, ranging in size from about 30 centimeters to a meter or more. And it's used primarily in ceremonial gift-giving. Now, while it can be made of various kinds of fabric, it's most commonly made of silk. And the characters used to write Fukusa reflect the fact that this is usually a soft form of silk. A Fukusa is laid over a gift. It's not wrapped around it, as is the more familiar furoshiki, which is unlined and often made of cotton. While a furoshiki is a wrapping cloth that can be knotted to carry, Fukusa do not lend themselves to this because they're often richly decorated with embroidery, which would be damaged if they were handled in this way. Yet even as Fukusa don't wrap, they do enclose, as you can see in the slide here. Because they were costly, in pre-modern times, the use of Fukusa was limited to the most affluent levels of society and to rituals such as birth, weddings, special birthdays, and seasonal festivals. Imbricated in gifting protocols that involve social conventions and reciprocal obligations, Fukusa were more about formality than they were about individual emotions. They materialize grades of rank, occupation, and stations in life, such as between teacher and student, as you've seen here, that were of profound importance in Japanese society, were and still are today. In such contexts, the present was presented on stage in a kind of social drama where it represented the giver and their relationship to the receiver. In other words, the performance, the spectacle of the performance was as important as the gift itself. The Fukusa in the Konbuin in Nara are the oldest surviving examples of these cloth coverings. They were donated to the temple in 1713 by Zuishunin, Shogun Tokugawa Tsunayoshi's favorite concubine. The example that you see on the screen incorporates a multiplicity of emblems associated with marital bliss, a pair of sake bottles, one with an auspicious hexagonal pattern, a lacquer pouring vessel, various kinds of flower and foliage. And then on top of it, adding another layer, are the stylized characters with wishes for long life and longevity. This is the kind of metaphorical layering that I'm going to talk about in the last part of my talk. So these characters are stitched over the already ornate embroidery in gold metallic thread, and they add an additional layer of sumptuousness. The materiality and craftsmanship of the Konbuin Fukusa are truly astonishing. They exemplify the extraordinary creativity and extravagance in dyed and stitched textile decor that's also found in 17th century male and female attire. It's no accident the Fukusa were first fashioned from silk, since silk was a medium of exchange that touched on every aspect of life in pre-modern Japan. In the 7th and 8th centuries, when there was not yet a money economy, tribute and taxes were paid to the court in the form of bolts of silk. And there are records from that period that list such and such a province must provide so and so many bolts of silk in what color, and so forth. Silk also served as a support for writing and painting. But also, textiles and garments for both men and women were standard gifts among the elite, as you see here. Oops, I think I've got to go back. There we go. So clothing made of silk was a standard gift among the elite. Rolls of silk figured especially prominently among dowry goods. The lavish wedding trousseau of the daughters of Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, for example, included Chinese satin, silk damask, as well as crepe, all types of silk that could be used both for garments and for fukusa. So there's a very close overlap, as you've seen from the exhibition, between the development of textile design for clothing. Let me go back here. There we go. For clothing and for fukusa. During the Tokugawa period, which extended from 1615 to 1868, however, only the aristocratic, the warrior, and the religious elite were permitted to wear clothing made of silk. Its luxury status underlay its use for fukusa. Although fukusa were important in the presentation of gifts, normally they were not themselves gifted. The recipient was expected to return the silk cover to the sender, carefully folded over a return gift. So there's an element of reciprocality here. Knowing when, where, and how to handle fukusa was an important part of formal etiquette in Japan. There's an amusing anecdote that I came across in the course of my research in the archives at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which has a number of fukusa in its collection. So they were donated by a family whose ancestors were merchants in Yokohama in the 1870s. And the records say that the family received a gift covered with these fukusa, but they didn't know that they were supposed to return the fukusa afterwards. So later, the embarrassed father of the young woman who received them tried to return them to the palace. Apparently they were imperial gifts, but was told to keep them. Now, as this anecdote testifies, not only were the foreigners unaware of the proper protocols, but fukusa continued to be used after the end of the feudal era, after the end of the Tokugawa period, in other words. And they are still occasionally used today, but they were certainly used quite often in the early 20th century. But I'm going to be focusing, although I will be showing fukusa of a later period, I'm basically focusing on their role during the Edo period. As the exhibition points out, during the Tokugawa period, there was a close relationship between the development of fukusa decor and that of fashionable dress. Both were parts of thriving commercial enterprises dependent on the combined skills of weavers, dyers, of embroiderers, and of painters. These were predominantly men, although women, although often unacknowledged, were often part of these workshops. Because the kimono, or kosode more appropriately, is basically a flat garment formed from 8 pieces of cloth sewn together without any tailoring, artists and designers could use their imaginations to create complex pictorial designs that flowed freely from shoulder to hem, as you see here on the left. As this is an outer robe that's been hand-painted with a bamboo motif with a mist of gold powder by the artist Gion Nankai. And many of the same motifs, as well as the techniques, weaving, embroidering, dyeing, and painting, or a combination of these, were also used to fashion fukusa, as the example on the right illustrates. Designers took advantage of cloth's capacity to flutter and fold, its capacity to lie flat or be rolled, to be smooth or textured, to cover and enclose, and to be layered. These were all qualities that made it as appealing to the hand as to the eye. I was very pleased to see when I visited the exhibition this morning that in the interactive section of the show, there are so small samples that allow you to feel the embroidery so that you can get a sense of the texture and to the kind of layering that I'm talking about today. Fukusa served a number of purposes, as much symbolic as practical. They ensure the ritual purity of that which they cover. They simultaneously conceal and reveal the presence of the gift beneath, introducing an element of surprise into its reception. They're freighted with specific emblematic meanings, deriving chiefly from the large vocabulary of conventional motifs that embellish them. But at the most basic level, the fukusa's primary function is to honor the recipient by adding a layer of ornamental splendor to their gift, and, by the same token, to display the wealth and taste of the giver. So there's meaning for the giver, showing off, if you will, and there's meaning for the recipient, because by giving a present with this elaborately decorated covering, you are showing your respect, you are honoring the recipient. So in this sense, layering is both material and metaphorical. So let me turn now to the culture and the aesthetics of layering, which, as I said at the outset, is more the focus than specifically spectacle in my talk today. Layering in ways that conjoined practical needs and ornamental appeal has a very long history in Japanese culture. The formal attire worn by court women in the 11th century, when the tale of Genji was written, was composed of multiple kimono-like robes, one worn on top of the other. Although this style of dress is known today as a junihitoe, literally 12 layers, in fact, the actual number of layers could vary. What was far more important than their actual number was the way that their combinations, as revealed at the neck and at the sleeve, whoops, need to go forward here. Yes, as you see here, displayed tasteful color schemes appropriate to the season and the occasion. This is a detail from a 17th century illustrated album of scenes from the Tale of Genji on the left. And if you've read the Tale of Genji, you'll know that the ability to combine these layers sensitively with an awareness of the different nuances of color and how they related to the seasons was tremendously important. One court lady of that period wrote in her diary, so-and-so really didn't know how to combine colors. I mean, there was a very strong fashion sense involved in putting together these layers of garments. So it was far more important how they were put together than how many there were. Now, the junihitoe was a mark of aristocratic status, owing to the sheer quantity of fabric and the amount of layer required to produce it. Obviously, only the wealthiest strata of society could afford to dress in this way. But it also limited the wearer's mobility. Imagine how much these weighed. And it meant that women didn't move around very much. Consequently, it largely disappeared in the 14th century. And today, it is only worn for very special occasions, as, for instance, as you see on the right-hand side, the Empress of Japan did. She wore this very cumbersome attire for her husband. This is Empress Michiko. She wore it for her husband's ascension to the throne in 1990. Well, that's one of the few occasions where you still see it today. But sartorial layering isn't unique, or wasn't unique, to women's attire. In the 18th century, men of the merchant class background who were prohibited from wearing silk developed a fashionable subterfuge that's revealed in this woodblock print by Utamaro. It shows a courtesan holding a jacket or haori open for a departing client, so that you see the inside of the garment. Now, the exterior of this garment is quite unremarkable, but its decoration features a lining with a depiction of the deity Daruma, which was hand-painted by a well-known artist. Now, this lining would only have been visible when the wearer removed his jacket in the presence of friends and intimates. And you can imagine that the pleasurable surprise provoked upon the revelation of the picture in the lining might be likened to that of a gift, the revelation of a gift which was concealed beneath a fukusa. Although in this case, the garment has a subversive, ironic, and deceptive twist that was not part of the fukusa tradition. But like the fukusa, this garment serves as a reminder that layering may involve creatively exploiting the two sides of a piece of fabric. In addition to the elaborate designs figuring on their upper face, some fukusa feature the giver's family crest on the lower right corner of the lining. In this case, the covering was laid, when it was presented, folded over the gift with the crest facing up and the pictorial design on the inside, and placed diagonally on top of the gift. When presented in this way, the recipient would unfold the fukusa to reveal the decor on the other side. Through touch, by unfolding this, a more intimate and embodied relationship was established not only between the person receiving it and the fukusa, but also by extension through the giver and receiver, in what was otherwise a very conventionalized ritual. More unusually, a fukusa might feature elaborate decoration on both sides. The front face of this fukusa features a composition of gilt-embroidered bamboo on a red ground, while the back is lined with a striking brocade. Both sides of this are equally spectacular. Fukusa like this demanded that the recipient engage physically with the cloth covering, feel the weight of the fabric, explore its textures with their fingers. And I think that this series of tactile actions carried out by the recipient are necessary to complete the meaning of this object. Just as a garment only becomes a garment when it covers a human body, so too a fukusa is not a gift cover if it does not actually dress a gift. As these two examples illustrate, one of the distinguishing properties of cloth is that it can be repeatedly folded and unfolded to alter its public face. This act can also reduce or increase its size. When not in use, kimono are carefully folded according to strict conventions. Reducing the size of garments facilitates their storage in lacquer boxes, such as the one that you see in this album leaf illustration from the tale of Genji. Today, both kimono and fukusa are also folded for storage. And it's very interesting when you actually have a chance to handle them, as I did the work on the right-hand side here. You can see the fold lines because they're folded in exactly the same way. And these fold lines, I think, are very revealing of the way these objects have been used and reused over time. So their fold lines, rather than being seen as a form of damage, should be seen as part of the object's history. Today, the art of origami, or paper folding, is enjoyed by as a leisure pastime by many people around the world. But knowing how to fold paper as well as cloth was an important part of etiquette in pre-modern Japan, both for men and women. Particularly for men, in folding letters, there were trick ways of folding letters so that you could be sure that no one would open it who wasn't supposed to open it, because if it was folded in a certain way and then you unfolded by the wrong person, you could see that you could see it afterwards from the fold marks. So folding papers for letters, and especially for the ornaments that accompany gifts, was a very highly developed art form in pre-modern Japan, and it continues to be so today, although it's usually done by professionals. In pre-modern times, the Ogawara school of etiquette, founded in the 12th century, laid down the rules for paper folding that are still followed, or that were followed by the court and the warrior elite. Their legacy endures today. And when social status was made visible through the knowledge of such matters, guidance on how to fold papers could be found in household encyclopedia, in instructional texts, as well as in dedicated etiquette manuals. There are still today surviving etiquette manuals dating from the 16th and 17th centuries. And these manuals include things from how to bow properly, how to use a fan, how to blow your nose, and when to blow your nose and when not to blow your nose, and what kind of table manners, how you pick up your chopsticks, what you eat first. They're really, really very, very interesting and very revealing of the degree to which social interaction was formalized and was supposed to follow certain rules. That doesn't necessarily mean that people followed them, but this was an ideal. I came across an interesting text in which an elderly warrior class man wrote an etiquette manual for his daughters in 1696, and he declared that one who didn't learn such etiquette from an early age, one who remained ignorant of such thing, would end up experiencing difficulty. He didn't say what kind of difficulty, but I think in the case of young women, it was probably they wouldn't find a suitable husband. But in the case of retainers, he continued, they should be taught to wrap and fold things properly. Now, he wasn't concerned with utilitarian wrapping, but rather with the papers that are intricately folded into auspicious shapes that accompany wedding gifts and the like. And these are 2 pages from an illustrated guide to wrapping, known as the Hoketsu Zusetsu. And this was considered an authoritative source on gift wrapping and knot tying, and it includes instructions for folding paper, as you can see on the left, as well as for tying knots on lacquer boxes on the right. The aesthetic appreciation of layering in Japan wasn't limited to textiles. I believe it may have contributed to the popularity of a style of carved lacquer that was imported from Yuan and Ming China that was much sought after by Japanese collectors. Carved lacquer can be predominantly red and black or composed of 3 alternating layers, most commonly black, red, and yellow. The rare 14th century incense container in the Metropolitan Museum, now on the screen, is formed, as you can see, from many strata of polychrome lacquer applied in a sequence of red, yellow, and black, red, and yellow. And these are revealed by carving into the lacquer very intricate pommel designs. This kind of lacquer incense container was especially prized by Japanese practitioners of the tea ceremony. Layering for ornamental effect figures prominently in the aesthetics of the tea ceremony, a popular practice among multiple classes during the Tokugawa period. Tea enthusiasts talked about their treasured tea utensils as bodies, often given their favorite tea utensils personal names, and thus individual, anthropomorphized identities. They also dressed their tea wares. This small container for powdered tea, for instance, was given the poetic name Shirotsuyu, white dew. It was further humanized, beyond the name, by the way that it was discussed in tea circles. Usually, tea utensils like this are described as having a neck, or having a mouth, kuchi, as having a neck, kubi, as having shoulders, kata, and so forth, using the analogy of the human body. Tea men adorned their treasured tea utensils for the visual delight of their guests, but also to honor the wearer, that is, the utensil itself. So there, I'm drawing here an analogy between honoring the recipient of a gift and honoring here the wearer of the tea utensil, the wearer of the clothing. Special clothing in the form of Chinese brocade bags was often made as fashion accessories for the tea caddies of the one that you see here. Now, these bags were not intended primarily to carry or protect, but rather to display and handle with guests during a gathering, during a tea ceremony. A particularly treasured tea caddy might have 2 or 3 of these bags, each one suitable for a more or less formal occasion. Like Fukusa, these objects only become meaningful through their handling, through the ritual, performative interventions carried out by the host and the guest in the tea room. Practitioners of tea considered large stoneware jars imported from southern China and repurposed in Japan to hold tea leaves as aesthetic objects that required dressing when put on display in the alcove of a tea room. The clothing of these large jars, which resemble many of the ones that you have on exhibition here, the clothing for these large jars could include a mouth cover, typically made of imported Chinese brocade. The red brocade cover with a swirling cloud pattern on this large jar in the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C., is not a practical necessity, since a paper seal fulfills this function, but it adds visual appeal, much as does a fukusa when laid over a gift. A net bag is also another layer, another part of a tea jar's outfit. While it serves to carry the jar in and out of the tea room, it's like a second skin that creates an additional visual and textual complexity to the vessel's body. Ornamental cords are further accessories that were deemed essential to the jar's formal presentation. Indeed, so important were these to the total effect that documents handed down with this particular jar include a guide to knotting the ornamental cords in 3 styles, depending on the level of formality of the tea gathering. Now, as you'll know, having seen the exhibition, woven silken cords in complex knots also feature prominently in several ceremonial presentation of many objects, as shown in this page from a manual that I showed earlier, explaining how to tie them over a hexagonal lacquer container. But knotted cords are also occasionally used for their ornamental effects on fukusa, as seen as this work representing what I think is a chrysanthemum in the exhibition from Chris Hall's collection. In addition, many fukusa also had intricately knotted tassels and cords at each corner, although today most are either lost or are replacements. So far, I've spoken about layer in broad terms that help to situate fukusa in relation to other forms of artistic expression in Japan. But now I want to focus more closely on the way silk cloth was used as a substrate for surface elaboration in the form of dyeing, embroidery, and other decorative treatment, drawing on examples in the Chris Hall collection. As we've seen, textile surfaces can be layered through various decorative processes, but needle and thread were used for a very large proportion of fukusa. The manipulation of silk floss, both twisted and untwisted, made it possible for the embroiderer to augment the fukusa's surface with a dramatic interplay of smoothness and texture, of movement and stasis. Now, embroidery had been used to decorate clothing and to create devotional imagery in Japan since the 8th century, but it reached its peak of technical sophistication in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And it's no accident, I believe, that this was also the moment when Fukusa came into vogue. Earlier, embroidery had been primarily a female occupation, but in this period, in the Tokugawa period, it became a male profession, although some women also served as assistants. We don't know the names of who made them, so we don't know whether they were, we don't know their gender. So how was a fukusa made? Well, to create a piece of embroidery, the substrate had to be stretched taut over a wooden frame, as you see here, and a pattern made of the design to be applied to it. Silk threads of different colors, as well as metallic thread, were then used to create the design in a variety of stitches. Long and short flat stitches, hiranui, very similar to satin stitch, were the fundaments of embroidery. Now, these long and flat stitches can be oriented in any direction depending on the motif. For example, a diagonal layer of hiranui stitching might be used to represent leaves or feathers, as seen here on the right. While the stitching creates different gradation of colors, it also builds up the surface of the silk. It gives it added weight, it's another layer. Sometimes two strands are twisted together to create thicker, more lustrous effects. Couching is another common layering technique in fukusa. Metallic threads are couched or sewn in place on the surface of the fabric with a fine, almost invisible twist of thread of the same or of a contrasting color. Metallic threads were used chiefly in this way, or were used primarily in this way, because if you try to pass this thick metallic thread through the silk, it could cause damage, so it was used on the surface. In these slides, you can see the bundles of shimmering gold threads held in place by a single red thread. And you can also see in the detail the way that it was bulked up, the way it was padded by inserting a cord beneath the couching. And there are quite a few fukusa in the show I could see much more clearly today than I saw in the photographs that have very high relief effects through padding. So when you go through the show, it's definitely worth looking out for this. Adding still more layering effects are glass eyes, which were incorporated into the design to create a more realistic effect. In addition, the borders of fukusa could be padded so that the cover could be elegantly draped over the gift so that it really fell nicely. This practice may have been influenced by that of weighting down the hem of outer garments worn by women to give them a sense of grandeur and gracious flow when they walk. So when they walk, the garment would fall behind them and give them enlarge their size. Though many of you may be familiar with Van Dyck portraiture and how he always elongates the body with these garments. Well, I think that wearing a kimono with a weighted hem has a very similar effect. These labor-intensive embroidery techniques and this weighting, the opulent materials, invest the fukusa with substance and authority. Like garments of power, fukusa are rich in ornament, color, luster, but also weight, sheer physical weight. So we've explored the culture and materiality of layering. Let's turn now to its metaphorical dimensions as expressed through the motifs, a third and the final lens through which I want to think about fukusa today. As I've already indicated, fukusa are performative objects. A mundane commodity is transformed into a gift by the very act of layering a decorative cover over it. The value of the gift is amplified by the time and skill required in the cover's ornamentation. Integrating complex representational messages adds further metaphorical weight to the fukusa. The motifs figuring on fukusa range widely, But those realized in the form of embroidery tend to be standardized and stylized, making them easily recognizable to the educated elite. The subject matter may draw on literary or theatrical sources, seasonal flora and fauna, or relate to particular festivals or rites of passage. Many motifs drew on themes of Chinese origin, such as the Seven Sages of the Bamboo Grove, a popular motif with literary connotations that figures on several fukusa in the Chris Hall collection. A scene of an elderly couple holding a rake and broom beneath a pine tree calls to mind the No play Takasago, about a couple whose spirits inhabit two old pine trees that over the years grew together as one. Cranes in flight might signify longevity, a motif appropriate for both weddings and birthdays. Such representations help to construct narratives meaningful to the occasion as well as to the individual being celebrated. In this sense, fukusa are sites of intersection between personal and collective identities, between past and present. The most basic requirement of a fukusa decor is to be felicitous and auspicious. Many kinds of motif lend themselves to this requirement. At weddings and New Year's celebrations, it was common practice to decorate pouring vessels and sake bottles with papers folded into stylized butterfly shapes known as ocho and mecho, convex for the male and concave for the female, tied with decorative paper cords suggesting antennae. These emblems of conjugal harmony were translated into flaring decorative motifs embroidered on fukusa, like the one now on the screen. Also associated with weddings was the shell matching games. Clamshells symbolized conjugal fidelity because each half of the bivalve can only match its mate. Sets of several hundred shells contained a pair of lidded octagonal lacquer containers tied with elaborately knotted cords, often figured in the dowries of women of the aristocratic and warrior elite. To play this game, one set of half shells from one container was arranged in concentric circles around a single shell from the other container, and then players competed on the basis of very close observation of the shape and the pattern of the deal shell to find its perfect, its unique mate. And this continued until all the shells were matched, with a person matching the most shells declared the victor. Now, both the shells and their elegant containers figure often among fukusa designed for use in celebrating betrothals. Of particular note Of particular note is the example here. In the example here is the way the designer has created a sense of movement and realistic texture through the high relief treatment of the red cords tied around the shell containers. When you go to the exhibition, be sure to look closely at this one so that you can see how thick, how heavily padded the decorative cords are. And I should add also that colors add another layer of metaphorical meaning. Red was a particularly auspicious color in Japan as in China. Among my personal favorites in the exhibition, here we go, is this exceptionally ornate gift cover featuring a motif known as takarabune, or treasure ship. In the Edo period, it was common practice to place a picture of a treasure ship under the pillow to generate dreams of happiness and prosperity in the new year. This motif often figures on gift covers. Here, the ship laden with its precious cargo is depicted in full frontal view with a crane swooping down from above and a long-tailed tortoise rising from the depths of the sea, adding further auspicious resonance. The treasures displayed on the ship's deck, however, are truly overshadowed by the dazzling gem-like embroidery of the sail. It's truly remarkable. The decorative floral and geometric motifs enclosed within each one of the hexagons, arranged in a pattern resembling tortoiseshell, kiko, reinforces the message of boundless abundance. As I've already mentioned, family crests often appear on the back of fukusa, but here one is worked into the intricate design on its face. Beyond its function in identifying the gift giver, it materializes the role of luxurious gift covers as constituents of family tradition, because as I said earlier, these are returned to the sender, so they're used again and again over the generations. Fukusa embody both spatial and temporal mobility. They're draped over and removed from gifts. They're folded and stored away, but they also move across generations, accruing in this process layers of individual. Goodness, that's dramatic. I hope I didn't set that off by something I said. So Fukusa accrue in the process of being handed over generations, individual and collective family memories. By materializing wealth, aesthetic taste, and social relationships, Fukusa perform work in a way that words cannot. Their communicative agency within Japanese culture follows from a combination of performative, material, and metaphorical layering that cuts across many forms of artistic expression in Japan, as I hope I've convincingly shown you today. The collector Chris Hall has said that he only acquires textiles with a wow factor. Fukusa certainly fall into this category. Their spectacular beauty challenges the stereotype that Japanese art is all about minimalism. Thank you. I think that we are preparing to answer any questions that you might have. So think about them, and I will be happy to address anything that you would like me to. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I can ask my first question while we're figuring out the mic. So thank you, Christine, for this really enlightening talk. I was really struck by the idea of Fukusa as dressing a gift and its involvement in layering over a gift. And I also started to think about the examples of Fukusa that we have in the show where we very clearly see the different layers of techniques. You know, we have the use and dye with some of the flowers left in reserve, layered with the embroidery, and then finally layered over with the gold. But then by the Meiji period, you start to see much more complete pictorial images that kind of hide the different layers and techniques that were used. Do you think this suggests a shift in the way that these textiles and these imagery was appreciated?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure that that I can answer it with any any certainty. But I think that there may be a tendency in the Meiji period to see them more in terms of their pictorial effects.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay, now, sorry.
You know, but there's very little written about Fukusa. I mean, this catalog that the museum has produced is a really important contribution to the field. But there's an awful lot more that needs to be studied before we really understand Fukusa. So I think it's wonderful that this exhibition is pioneering the study of this form of expression. These are the most comfortable chairs I've ever sat on a stage. I feel like I'm sitting on a throne or something.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, for your presentation. Okay, so can you say a little bit more about the recycling part of these cloths? As in, you said it went generations, but were there rules on when an actual Fukusa can be used by the next generation? And in other words, if it's like for weddings, this one would come out again when so-and-so marries in the next generation. So you don't overuse these things in the recycling of it, right? And another question related to that is, how many of these cloths would a family have?
Those are wonderful questions. I wish I could answer them. I really scoured the sources to see find anything written about Fukusa. Sorry, am I echoing? Is that better? I don't think I can answer that question. We do know that these were handed down. They were only used on special occasions, obviously birthdays and so forth. But after I'd submitted my essay for the catalog, I came across a very interesting reference in a Meiji source written by a British woman who was working for an elite family in Japan. And she said that the New Year's banquet was presented and that Fukusa were draped over that banquet. So that sort of confirms there's an image, I think, in the catalog showing the presentation of a New Year's banquet with the Fukusa draped over it. So I think Fukusa were used not just for birthdays and so forth, but for New Year's, something like that. And they would have been, as you correctly pointed out, that they were used again and again, but how often they were used, we don't know. I was able to study a private collection in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she had a couple of Fukusa that were really worn, suggesting that they had been used very often, and they were probably sold because they were not good enough to present anymore, but they were interesting historical documents. So that's a very flimsy answer to your question, but it's a very good question, and hopefully there'll be more research and we'll be able to find out, answer those.
Thank you, Christine. This is interesting topics. I just wonder, what is the difference between furoshiki and the fukusa? Is this fukusa evolved from furoshiki? Because it's nowadays a look at it. Some of the furoshiki can be very expensive and made of silk as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for your question. You're absolutely right. Some furoshiki are made of silk and they're very fancy, but I don't think that they evolved out of furoshiki. Furoshiki started as something very practical, whereas Fukusa definitely did not start as a practical necessity. They were a decorative addition. They were an addition to gift giving. Just as I've tried to suggest today, they added a layer of ornamental splendor, of meaning, and sheer physicality to the gift.
Hi, thank you so much for your very interesting talk. Most of the things you've told us has a directional element, more in the giving. Could you elaborate on conditions for returning? Because there was a very interesting point made about someone not knowing that after receiving. So I think many of these fukusas, their motifs are supposed to mean something, and they may be for a wedding. So how would the returner, they return it very soon? And for one occasion, if it was already meant for a wedding, for example.
Well, the gift giving in which Fukusa figured was not, it wasn't a kind of informal birthday party where everybody's having fun. These were very conventionalized hierarchical relationships they embodied these hierarchical relationships. So if someone gave a present, the recipient was expected to return them. I mean, even as today, presents are if someone gives you a present, you're expected to give something in return. So Fukusa were part of that kind of exchange. And I think in manuals, etiquette manuals, there was information about when and how these things were, when and how gifts should be returned. But there's very little that addresses specifically the use of Fukusa, at least as far as I've researched. But there are people whose ability to handle Edo period sources. I mean, I can only handle Edo period sources that are printed in katsuji. I can't read a handwritten manuscript, but there are people who can, and those are the people who are going to find out the kinds of questions that you're asking that I wish I could answer.
My question, and first of all, thank you very much for such an interesting talk and the beautiful illustrations. My question is about the silk and the actual embroidery. First of all, we're already in the realm of the nobility because they were made for their use. Could you tell us a bit about the workshops and the specialists who were involved in the embroidery? Were they special workshops under within the royal household, or were they special people outside, merchants or craftsmen who were involved in this? I'm sorry, and were silk weaving as well. Thank you.
I think the answer is both. Textile was a major industry during the Edo period, particularly in Kyoto. I mean, weaving, embroidery, and dyeing were big business. And there were lots of family firms that still survive today that were involved in those businesses. They were collaborative enterprises that involved weavers, dyers, embroiderers, and so forth. And in many cases, they were family firms, workshops, or if not actual families, workshops organized along family lines. And they, as I said, they were commercial enterprises. But alongside those, there also existed within the imperial court dedicated workshops for weaving, dyeing, and embroidery. So these two forms coexisted. And I think that the level, the quality of the Fukusa could probably differed depending on where they were produced. I mean, the one that I showed you from the Kombuin, I mean, there about 20 of them survive. And they are dazzling. They're beyond anything else, any other Fukusa I've seen. And those, I'm pretty sure, must have been produced in a shogunal or an imperial workshop. So does that answer your question?
Okay, we've now come to the end of the session. Thank you once again, Christine, for your great talk. If you haven't already, we hope you'll visit the Fukusa exhibition. It's on view at the Peranakan Museum until the 25th of August. We're also selling discounted copies of the exhibition catalog for tonight only outside until 8:15 p.m. And we hope that you can join us for our next iteration of ACM Conversations titled Fashion in Cities, which will feature a panel of fashion designers from Singapore. And we will also appreciate if you could give us your feedback for the session by scanning the QR code up on screen here. And it'll help us improve the way we organize and conduct our lectures. And I'd like to thank once again Royal Insignia for the kind sponsorship of this talk. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you next time. Good night.